So, do you see that?
Just a second. Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, so thank you very much for the invitation to be part of this really interesting seminar with great talks and thank you, Michael, for the great talk showing the so many things that we still have to do in the huge area of the deserts and with all these kinds of structures. So my presentation will focus on excavations carried out in the area of Al-Ula some years ago in the framework of the wider large-scale archaeological project conducted by the Royal Commission for Al-Ula and implemented by Oxford Archaeology at the time. So the ground survey conducted led to the identification of thousands of sites and structures, and in parallel, a program of targeted excavation was set up in order to document more specifically late prehistoric remains. These excavations focused mainly on cairns and megalithic funerary monuments, as they represent a significant proportion of the archaeological record. But it also included the investigation of Mustatils that I will talk about today. So Melissa introduced you to the Mustatil structures yesterday, so I think there is no need to develop too much here on the definition as well as on the history of research on these structures. I'll just recall here that they are rectangular elongated structures defined by 2 to 4 parallel long walls and closed by thicker walls on the smaller sides, often incorporating arrangements of circular structures of various types. So these structures are quite massive, and as their length can reach several hundreds of meters. The work on these structures is really only at its beginning still, but thanks notably to the work of Melissa and her team, the extent of the distribution area of the Mustatils is quickly unrevealed, extending mainly in a wide triangle region defined by Medina, Ha'il, and Al-Ula, thus stretching towards the northwestern extremity of the Nefud Desert, with a main concentration in Khaybar area, and to a lesser extent in the region of Al-Ula. So during ground surveys in Al-Ula County, a number of Mustatils were identified as well. We undertook excavations in 3 distinct Mustatils located on the eastern side of Al-Ula, along the southern side of the main road leading to Ha'il. One of the 3 Mustatils, ID has 687, that we named the Horn Chamber Mustatil, has been extensively excavated and provided unprecedented results, as it provided remains in an exceptional state of preservation, allowing to get a very detailed understanding of the ritual nature of the structure. I will therefore focus on the presentation of the results from this specific Mustatil today. So the Mustatils we excavated in Al-Ula area are of a specific type. They are constituted of a rectangular structure having the 2 characteristic long walls abutting a sandstone outcrop. Contrary to other Mustatil types, it is therefore the outcrop that closes one of the small sides of the rectangle. At the Horn Chamber Mustatil, 2 cairn structures were identified at the junction of the long walls with the outcrop. It's the features you can see on this slide here, SU100 and SU200, that are hidden below the overhang. And the excavation of one of these 2 structures provided important results that I will detail in the next slides. So the excavation uncovered a rectangular platform, 7 meters long for 2.5 meters wide, including 2 internal compartments. It showed to have 2 distinct phases, or 2 distinct phases were identified during the excavation. The first, and original phase of use was represented by the discovery at the base of the rear compartment of a spectacular amount of faunal remains. The second phase of use, which I will not detail here, shows the reuse of the original compartment as a burial in a later chronological period of time. So we can see on this slide the orthophoto of the original phase of use of feature SU100, showing the two distinct compartments, one at the front and one at the back against the outcrop. At the base of the rear compartment, we uncovered a layer of 20 to 25 centimeters thick of densely packed faunal remains of a very specific kind. Especially amazing was the preservation state. Keratin of the horn's sheath was preserved. The bones were actually naturally mummified, thanks to the overhang which protected it from the rainfall. Amongst the various mustatils excavated to now, the faunal assemblage of the horn chamber mustatil is quite spectacular by the nature of the faunal remains, their preservation state, and also by their amount. So the assemblage is interesting because of the diversity of species represented. These are predominantly represented by domestic species. Goats are overwhelmingly represented, a few sheep, and interestingly, cattle is also attested, being the second most represented species. Besides the domestic species, wild hunted species were also represented, although to a lesser extent. So we have ibex, gazelle, and evidence for auroch. The latter is crucial as evidence for auroch in northern Arabia still remains uncertain and is of importance to tackle the issue of introduction of cattle domestication into the Arabian Peninsula. So the total minimum number of individuals in the deposit reaches a considerable amount of 67 animals. From an economy and subsistence strategies point of view, the species spectrum reflects a hunter's-herder's subsistence strategy, one that has been described for the desert margins of the southern Levant, in eastern Jordan notably, for the early stages of introduction of herding in these areas. But interestingly, the domestic species found at the Horn Chamber Mustatil point to a mixed caprine cattle pastoralism, distinct from what is known in the southern Levantine marginal zone, where pastoralism is exclusively for these periods oriented towards caprines. This might as well have major implications as regard to environmental reconstruction, as cattle is known to require a wetter environment than sheep and goat herds, and Melissa discussed this aspect yesterday as well. So the mustatils, in fact, in general, shed light on the specificity of the trajectories of neolithization in this region of northern Arabia. The assemblage itself is composed exclusively of skull elements of these horned species. The total number of remains reaches 926 elements. Basically, we have four different types of elements that are represented within the assemblage. The first type is horns, entire horns. The second type is horns chest only, meaning the keratin detached from the horn core. The third type is maxillaries isolated from skulls. And the fourth type is bucrania, worked bucrania. So the remains evidence various forms of marks, cut marks as well as chop marks, which result from the preparation of these elements. These scars are definitely not the result of culinary or domestic preparation. They instead indicate that these faunal remains were prepared as objects. The separation of the sheath from the horn corn, for instance, is a complex and time-consuming task, which requires storing the horns for some period of time and or boiling it during hours to be able to remove the sheath from the horn core. In other words, these faunal remains involve specific complex preparation, and I will come back on this later on. So the spatial analysis of the faunal assemblage does not reflect a clear patterning in the distribution of the remains, at least at first glance. Here we have tried analysis of the assemblage through sex distribution first, anatomical element type of objects, and by species as well. But no real pattern was appearing through these various criteria. Instead, some form of organization of the deposit seems, however, to prevail when comparing domestic versus wild animals. The remains of wild species, which constitute a much lower proportion of the assemblage, seem to be concentrated in the central area of the compartment. Surprisingly, this is also where a number of remarkable objects, which stand out from the overall bulk of the material, were also located. So amongst these distinct artifacts, noteworthy are a huge auroch horn sheath, an almost complete skull of cattle, actually the only complete skull of the assemblage, an impressive ibex horn, as well as a large bucrania of goat. It appears, therefore, that some objects which stand out as more unusual and maybe more valuable are deposited in the center of the compartment. Some details also point to some form of organization. This is the case of a compact group of goat horns, which suggests they have been deposited as a single bundle of items, most likely by a same person. And finally, it appeared that the bedrock at the base of the compartment was covered with vegetal twigs. This clearly reflects a preparation and special care for the intentional deposition of the faunal remains over a bedding of vegetal material covering the entire compartment, and thus suggesting the use of the totality of its internal space since the very beginning of its use. So the ritual cultic nature of the deposit is also reflected by the overall organization of feature SU100. Inside the front compartment, two hearths were found located at both extremities of the compartment from both sides of a blockade access leading from the open courtyard space of the Mustatil. The hearths are obviously not domestic in nature, as they didn't provide any remains of burnt animal bones, for instance. And the overall architecture organization shows some form of solemnity with a formal arrangement involving symmetry and a megalithic construction with a special care. The radiocarbon dating was achieved on multiple material sources from the Mustatil excavation, basically on charcoal remains from the different hearths identified, as well as on collagen from the animal bones of the faunal deposit itself. All the dates are very consistent, and they point to a construction and use of the Mustatil during the Neolithic at circa 5200 Cal BC. So these results provide, therefore, some of the earliest evidence available for domesticates and pastoralism in this strategic region of northern Arabia, and they fit actually very well with the data presented by Melissa yesterday. So the faunal remains of the horn chamber Mustatil constitute a unique and unprecedented assemblage in the context of North Arabian Neolithic. Its exceptional state of preservation allows us to get maybe deeper in the reconstruction of the ritual performance than what most of the time archaeological data allows us to do. The zooarchaeological study emphasized two essential aspects of this deposit. The first is the selectivity of the faunal remains with a focus on cranial elements and adult males. The second is the complex preparation involved, resulting in the production of objects from the animal skulls, including chopping and shaping bucrania, skinning, mandible dislocation and removal, and the processing of horns for sheath separation from the bony core. It is clear that the faunal assemblage differs from communal feasting deposits, and it seems instead to represent the sum of objects that have a complex history and provenance prepared on a small individual or household scale. Some may have been intentionally created as ritual offerings, specifically for the Mustatil since the very beginning. Others may be instead objects of high symbolic value, possibly prepared and owned in a daily secular context as trophies. That have been turned, these trophies will have been turned later into votive offerings within the deposit because of their intrinsic value. As for the interpretation of the data, it essentially relates to the understanding of the faunal remains deposit itself. Based on the exceptionally well-preserved faunal deposit in the horn chamber Mustatil, we believe that it is the result of a single event, and a set of evidence points to this. The fact that the faunal elements are packed in a dense and compact layer with almost no sediment between the faunal remains, the coherence in the placement of the remains in a structured deposition with no evidence of displacement indicative of subsequent addition of new elements, the spatial analysis also of the assemblage indicating some sort of organization with some sort of scenography with the placement of wild speeches and remarkable pieces at the center of the deposit, and finally the preparation of the deposit compartment with the coating of vegetal twigs covering its entire internal space. All these clues reflect a harmonious, coordinated deposit of artifacts in a structured deposition that we believe probably happened during a single event and during the same ritual ceremony. As for the Mustatil overall layout, the interesting thing is that it brings together two clearly distinct components. The wide open-air courtyard, suggesting the gathering of large groups of people, thus reflecting monuments intended to be used at the wider tribal group for specific ritual occasions. And on the other hand, we have the smaller platform with its two distinct compartments. While the rear compartment is clearly dedicated to the deposition of the faunal remains, the front compartment acts as a small, intimate antechamber for which a sacred dimension can be suggested, and which can be qualified actually as a shrine. So it is always difficult to hypothesize on how the ritual was performed in detail, but it appears that there is a shift in this specific case from a communal dimension in the courtyard to a more individual scale in the shrine. One suggested hypothesis is that individuals from the groups gathered in the open-air courtyard, representatives of the families or of the clans, would have entered the sacred shrine successively, one after the other, to contribute their offering of a trophy on behalf of the social group they represent. In any case, the accumulation of faunal objects prepared at a smaller individual or at the household level would ultimately constitute a collective ritual hoard expressing a cohesive identity of the wider tribal social group. The communal dimension, as well as the role of the Mustatil in expressing social memory, identity, and territorial claims, conform with a tradition of ceremonial and ritual monuments attributed to mobile pastoralists. In this respect, it appears that the Mustatil phenomenon is in line with an inherited tradition of open-air sanctuaries attested in the desert margins of the southern Levant and North Arabia that emerged during the Neolithic period, closely tied to the emergence of pastoral nomadic way of lives. Although such monuments vary in shape and organization, they share an obvious basic characteristic, which is the symbolic delineation of a physical space of open air, unroofed courtyard. Most of the time, however, very few artifacts or material culture originates from these sites, which were used as cult sanctuaries on an occasional basis, rendering therefore difficult any attempt of detailed interpretation of the ritual performance itself. So this broad tradition of open-air sanctuaries in the barren landscape has spanned the ages and actually can still be tracked nowadays amongst modern pastoralists who use open-air mosques as opposed to the constricted roofed mosques in the sedentary zones. Of course, my aim is not at all here to flatten the diversity of chronocultural entities of desert margins. We spoke about this flattening issue yesterday. And indeed, the various open-air sanctuaries or cult structure identified obviously encompass very different chronological and cultural contexts and very different spiritual and ritual behaviors. And clearly, the Mustatils reflect a specific chronocultural entity on its own, previously unknown for this region and for this period of time. But I just rather wanted to highlight as a conclusion that these open-air sanctuaries might, in the end, illustrate maybe best one of the ideas that has been considered at the background for this seminar, dealing with cult and sacred landscapes in the arid margins, crossing space and time on the longue durée, and showing some form of continuity of cultic and ritual performance through a broad geographical space beyond chronocultural entities. Thank you.